What most people misunderstand about empaths with few or no friends is that their loneliness is not a wound, it's a boundary. We live in a world that treats friendship like a numbers game. The more people around you, the more loved you must be. The more social your life looks, the more whole you must feel. But for some people, the ones who feel everything deeply, who carry the emotions of others like a second skin, surrounding yourself with many people isn't connection, it's survival mode. Empaths don't pull away from people because they don't care. They pull away because they care too much. Every conversation leaves a residue. Every room full of people drains something that takes days to refill. They have sat across from someone who was smiling and felt in their chest that something was deeply wrong. They have loved people who didn't even love themselves. And over time, they learned a painful but necessary truth that not everyone deserves access to a soul that feels this deeply. So they become selective, quiet, misread as cold, distant, or antisocial. But here is what no one tells you: the empath who stands alone isn't broken. They are simply unwilling to lose themselves just to feel included. And that kind of self awareness, most people spend a lifetime never finding it. Think about the last time you walked into a room full of people. For most, that experience feels neutral, maybe even energizing. But for an empath, walking into that same room is something else entirely. Before they even say a word, something has already begun. They are picking up signals, emotions, undercurrents that no one else seems to notice. The tension between two people across the room, the forced smile of someone pretending to be okay, the quiet sadness hiding behind loud laughter. They didn't ask to notice these things, they just do. And by the time they leave that room, they are carrying weight that was never theirs to begin with. This is not a metaphor. This is the daily reality of living as an empath. The absorption is not something they switch on or off. It happens automatically, beneath the surface, like breathing. And just like breathing in polluted air eventually damages the lungs, absorbing the emotional atmosphere of everyone around you eventually damages something deep inside. Not permanently, but enough to make you need time, real, quiet, undisturbed time, just to feel like yourself again. This is why so many empaths end up with small social circles, or sometimes none at all. Not because they are unfriendly, not because they lack personality or depth, but because every single interaction costs them something. A casual lunch with a colleague leaves them mentally exhausted. A family gathering can wipe out an entire weekend of emotional energy. A phone call with someone going through a hard time means the empath lies awake that night, thinking, processing emotions that technically belong to someone else. When connection consistently feels this heavy, the natural response is to limit it. Not out of coldness, but out of necessity. What makes this harder is that most people will never understand it. To the outside world, the empath who cancels plans, who prefers staying home, who takes days to reply to messages, looks like someone who simply doesn't care. They get labeled as antisocial, introverted to an extreme, difficult, hard to reach. And the empath, who already carries so much, now has to carry the guilt of being misunderstood on top of everything else. They want to explain it. But how do you explain to someone that being around people, even people you love, sometimes feels like standing in the middle of a storm with no shelter? So they stop explaining. And slowly, the friendships thin out, not because the empath gave up on people, but because the cost of maintaining those connections, while also maintaining their own inner stability, became too high to sustain. Here is something important to understand. The exhaustion an empath feels around people is not about the people themselves. It's about what the empath cannot stop themselves from doing in the presence of others. They mirror, they absorb. They tune in at a frequency that most people don't even know exists. When someone near them is anxious, the empath feels a quiet anxiety rise in their own chest. When someone is grieving, the empath doesn't just feel sympathy, they feel grief, real and physical, as if it belongs to them. When someone is angry, even if they say nothing, the empath feels that anger like a shift in air pressure. This is not sensitivity in the soft, gentle sense of the word. This is a nervous system that is wired to receive what others broadcast, whether they want it or not. Science actually supports this. Research on mirror neurons, the brain cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing it, suggests that some people have a far more reactive mirroring system than others. For these individuals, the emotional experiences of others are not just observed. They are felt, almost as if they were personal. Empaths tend to live at the extreme end of this spectrum. Their brain doesn't just register that someone is in pain, it simulates that pain internally. And doing that over and over in every social interaction is genuinely draining in a neurological sense. This is not weakness, this is biology. But knowing the science doesn't make it easier to live with, because the world is not designed for people who feel this way. Society rewards those who can move quickly between social situations, who can be around many different people without losing themselves, who can maintain dozens of relationships simultaneously without burning out. The empath cannot do this, not sustainably. And when they try, when they push themselves to be more social, more available, more like everyone else, they don't just feel tired. They feel like they are disappearing, like the version of themselves that feels calm and grounded and whole is slowly getting buried under everyone else's noise. This is why solitude for an empath is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is an ache, a wanting, a feeling of being cut off from something you need. Solitude for an empath is restoration. It is the only environment where they can hear themselves think without someone else's thoughts bleeding in, where they can feel their own emotions without confusion about whose emotions they actually are. where they can exist without the constant, invisible labor of absorbing and processing and managing the emotional world of the people around them. Solitude is not where empaths go because they have failed at connection, it is where they go to survive it. And yet there is grief in this, real grief, because empaths, more than almost anyone, long for deep, genuine soul level connection. The very thing that makes being around most people exhausting, their ability to feel deeply, is also what makes them extraordinary friends when they do let someone in. They listen in a way that makes people feel truly heard. They notice things others miss. They hold space without judgment. They love with a depth and sincerity that is rare. The cruelty of being an empath is that the capacity for profound connection is always there, burning quietly, while the energy required to maintain that connection in the everyday world keeps running out. This creates a particular kind of ache. The empath who sits alone on a Friday night is not someone who doesn't want friendship. They are someone who wants the kind of friendship that doesn't cost them their peace. And that kind, the rare, honest, mutual, unhurried kind, is genuinely hard to find. Most social interaction is transactional, surface level, full of performance and noise. For someone who can feel the difference between what a person is saying and what they are actually experiencing, spending time in that kind of interaction doesn't just feel empty, it feels false. And the empath would rather be alone in truth than surrounded by people in a lie. This is not arrogance, it is not superiority. It is a form of self-knowledge that most people spend their entire lives without reaching. The empath has learned, often through exhaustion and heartbreak and the long aftermath of giving too much to the wrong people, exactly what they can and cannot sustain. They have learned that their energy is not infinite, that their emotional reserves need protecting, that spending themselves completely on every person who comes along leaves nothing for the people or the moments that actually matter. So they choose carefully, sometimes too carefully, sometimes in ways that feel like isolation. But beneath that choice is always the same quiet wisdom. I know what I am, and I will not destroy it just to fit in. There is strength in that. Not the loud, visible kind of strength, but the quiet, enduring kind that most people never develop because they were too busy filling every silence with noise, too afraid to sit alone long enough to understand themselves. The empath who has few friends has not failed at life. They have simply refused to pretend that quantity is the same as depth, that presence is the same as connection, that being surrounded is the same as being seen. And in a world that rarely stops long enough to feel anything real, that refusal is not a weakness. It is one of the rarest forms of courage there is. There is a particular kind of discomfort that empaths know well. It happens in the middle of a perfectly normal conversation. Someone is talking, smiling, saying all the right things, and yet something inside the empath goes still, quiet, alert. Because what is being said and what is being felt are two completely different things. The words are fine, but underneath the words, there is something else. A tension, a hidden agenda, a performance. And the empath cannot unhear it, cannot unsee it, cannot simply smile and move on as if everything is fine, because to them it clearly isn't. This is the gift and the burden of being someone who detects inauthenticity almost involuntarily. It is not something they trained themselves to do. It is not a skill they develop consciously. It is simply how they receive people. Like a tuning fork that vibrates at the frequency of truth, the empath feels the dissonance when something doesn't match, when the kindness feels performed, when the laughter feels hollow, when the friendship feels like it has conditions buried just beneath the surface. They pick it up the way others pick up sound, naturally, immediately, without effort. And in a world where so much of social interaction is built on performance, this ability makes genuine connection feel almost impossible to find. Think about how most friendships actually function. People present the best version of themselves. They curate what they share, manage how they are perceived, keep certain truths carefully hidden. This is not always malicious. Most of it is just human. People are afraid of rejection, afraid of being judged, afraid that if they show too much of the real thing, people will leave. So they wear a version of themselves that feels safer, softer, more acceptable. And for most people, interacting with that curated version is completely fine. They don't notice the gap between the mask and the face. The conversation feels normal. The friendship feels real enough. But for the empath, that gap is impossible to ignore. They are not interacting with the mask. They are feeling what is behind it, the anxiety someone is hiding, the resentment sitting just beneath a polished smile, the loneliness that exists inside someone who presents as completely fine. The empath doesn't need to be told these things. They already know. And knowing creates a strange, exhausting problem. They are expected to respond to what is being shown, while internally processing what is actually real. They have to hold both truths at once, every time, in nearly every interaction. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous amount of invisible work. Over time, this creates a deep weariness with surface-level friendship. Not frustration exactly, more like a quiet resignation. The empath has sat through enough small talk to know that it will not become anything more. They have invested in enough friendships that stayed permanently shallow to recognize the pattern early. They have watched people perform closeness without ever actually offering it. And at some point, the energy required to keep showing up for connections that never deepen simply stops feeling worth it. Not because the empath has given up on people, but because they have become honest, maybe painfully honest, about what most social interaction actually is. This honesty isolates them, because the world runs on social performance, and opting out of that performance makes you difficult to place. The empath who won't do small talk, who can't pretend to find shallow conversation fulfilling, who refuses to maintain friendships that feel fundamentally false, that person gets read as cold, as intense, as someone who takes things too seriously. And what people rarely understand is that the empath isn't being difficult. They are simply incapable of pretending not to notice what they notice. Asking them to enjoy surface level connection is like asking someone with perfect pitch to enjoy a song played badly out of tune. The ability to perceive the problem makes it impossible to ignore. What empaths are actually searching for, what they have always been searching for, is the rare experience of encountering someone who is genuinely uncomplicatedly real. Someone who says what they mean, who shows what they feel, who doesn't perform kindness but actually lives it, who is the same person in private that they are in public. This is not a high standard in theory, but in practice it is extraordinarily rare, and the empath knows this. They have encountered enough people to understand that authenticity, true authenticity, is not the default, it is the exception. And waiting for the exception means spending a lot of time alone. Here is something worth sitting with. The empath's sensitivity to inauthenticity is not paranoia. It is not them looking for reasons to push people away. Research consistently shows that human beings communicate far more through nonverbal channels than through words alone. Tone of voice, micro-expressions, posture, timing. The way someone pauses before answering a question. The slight shift in their eyes when something they say isn't quite true. Most people process these signals unconsciously, without ever bringing them to the surface. Empaths process them consciously, loudly, and immediately. What others sense vaguely as a feeling they can't explain, the empath experiences as clear and undeniable information. And once you have that information, you cannot simply choose to disbelieve it. This is why so many empaths describe the feeling of being surrounded by people they don't fully trust. Not because those people are necessarily bad, but because the empath can feel the performance, can feel the parts that aren't being shown, can feel the distance between who someone is presenting and who they actually are. And trying to build real closeness across that distance is like trying to hold someone's hand through a wall. You can sense them there, but you can never quite reach them. The longing this creates is real and it runs deep, because the empath does not want to be alone. That is not the truth of their situation, even when it looks that way from the outside. The truth is that they want connection more than most people do. They feel the absence of it more sharply. They know what it could be, what it feels like when it is real, and that knowledge makes every imitation of it unbearable. They would rather have one conversation in a year that is completely honest than 100 that are carefully managed. They would rather have one friend who shows up without a mask than a room full of people performing friendship while remaining fundamentally unavailable. And so they wait. They move slowly. They watch before they trust. They let silence stretch out in conversations to see how someone handles it. They say something real early, just to see if the other person will match it or retreat. They are not testing people out of cruelty. They are looking for the signal, the small unmistakable signal that this person is actually here, that what they are showing is what they are, that the friendship being offered is the real thing and not a careful construction designed to get something in return. When they find it, and sometimes, rarely they do, the depth of connection that follows is unlike anything most people ever experience. Because two people who are both genuinely present, both willing to be fully seen, both past the need for performance, can reach a level of closeness that most social interaction never approaches. The empath, freed from the labor of sensing inauthenticity, freed from the exhaustion of holding two truths at once, can simply be, can give, can receive, can exist in the full warmth of a connection that costs nothing to maintain because it is built entirely on what is real. But until that person appears, and sometimes they do not appear for years, the empath lives in the difficult space of knowing exactly what they are looking for while being surrounded by everything. It is not. They know the difference too clearly to settle. They feel the absence too sharply to pretend. And they have learned through enough disappointment that accepting a counterfeit version of connection does not fill the emptiness. It only makes it harder to remember what the real thing feels like. A soul that can feel the difference between truth and performance will never find peace in a life built on pretending it cannot. There is a pattern that almost every empath eventually recognizes in their own life. They look back at the friendships and relationships that have come and gone, and they notice something that is both clarifying and painful. The people they gave the most to were almost always the people who needed the most fixing, the ones in constant crisis, the ones who called at midnight with emergencies that happened every other week, the ones whose problems never fully resolved no matter how much time, energy, or love was poured into them, the ones who took everything offered and came back the next day as empty as before. The empath gave and gave and gave, and somehow it was never enough. And somehow they kept giving anyway. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. And understanding why it happens is one of the most important things an empath can do for their own survival. Empaths, by their very nature, radiate something that emotionally wounded people can feel from a distance. It is not visible, it is not announced, but it is real. The capacity to listen without judgment, the ability to hold someone's pain without flinching, the instinct to understand before responding, the genuine desire to help. These qualities are extraordinary. In the right relationships, they create bonds of remarkable depth and trust, but in the wrong ones, they function like a beacon. And the people most drawn to that beacon are not always the ones who will honour it. Often, they are the ones who have learned, consciously or not, to use warmth as a resource. Emotional manipulators, chronic victims, people with deep unresolved wounds who have never sought real help. These individuals are drawn to empaths with an almost magnetic pull. They sense correctly that here is someone who will not turn them away, someone who will stay when others leave, someone who will absorb their pain without making them feel like a burden. And so they come, they share, they lean, and the empath, feeling everything the other person carries, feeling the genuine weight of their suffering, steps forward. Because to feel someone's pain and do nothing feels like a kind of abandonment. And abandonment is something empaths find very difficult to inflict on others, even when it would be the healthiest choice for everyone involved. What follows is a slow and exhausting unraveling. The empath begins investing time, emotional energy, presence. They show up consistently, they listen endlessly, they offer perspective, comfort, solutions. They celebrate small wins and absorb large setbacks. They rearrange their own needs around the needs of the other person, often without even realizing it is happening. And for a while, this feels like what love and friendship are supposed to look like. It feels like depth, like meaning, like being truly needed. But being needed is not the same as being valued. The difference reveals itself slowly. The empath notices that the conversations are always about the other person. That when they try to share something of their own, a struggle, a fear, a moment of vulnerability, the topic somehow shifts back. That the support they give so freely is rarely, if ever, returned. That the other person is fully present when they need something and strangely unavailable when they don't. That the friendship exists primarily in one direction, and yet the empath stays because they can still feel the other person's pain. Because leaving feels like giving up on someone who is suffering. Because somewhere inside they believe that if they just give a little more, something will shift. The other person will heal. The balance will come. The relationship will become what the empath has been quietly hoping it would be. That shift, most of the time, never comes. And when the empath finally reaches the breaking point, when the exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore, when the emptiness of a one-sided bond becomes undeniable, they don't just feel tired. They feel foolish, used, ashamed that they gave so much to someone who was never truly offering anything in return. They question their own judgment. They wonder how they missed it. They replay the history of the friendship, looking for the moment they should have walked away. And underneath all of that is something even heavier: grief. Because the empath didn't just lose a friend, they lost the version of that friendship they had been hoping for. The one that existed in their imagination while the real one was draining them dry. This cycle, repeated enough times, changes a person, not in an instant, gradually. The way erosion works, each one-sided relationship carves away a little more of the empath's willingness to open up. Each experience of giving without receiving makes the next act of trust feel more dangerous. Each friendship that ended in exhaustion or betrayal adds another layer of caution to how the empath approaches new people. They don't become cold, but they become careful in a way they weren't before. They start reading people more slowly, holding back more, waiting longer before they give access to the parts of themselves that have been hurt before. And this is where the isolation deepens, because the empath is now navigating two opposing forces simultaneously. The need for genuine connection, which hasn't gone away, which may in fact have grown sharper in the absence of it. And the hard-won knowledge that their openness, their warmth, their capacity to feel deeply, these things attract people who will take everything and leave nothing. So they pull back. They choose solitude over the risk of another cycle that ends in depletion. They protect what little emotional energy they have left rather than spending it on someone who will drain the account and disappear. From the outside, this looks like someone who has become closed off, someone who doesn't let people in, someone who seems fine alone in a way that feels almost unnatural. But from the inside, it is simply self-preservation. The empath has learned, through lived experience, that the cost of choosing the wrong people is not just disappointment. It is a particular kind of damage that takes a very long time to repair, the kind that makes you doubt your own instincts, the kind that makes warmth feel dangerous, the kind that turns one of your greatest strengths into something you have to guard carefully like a flame in the wind. What gets lost in this process is heartbreaking. Because the empath who has been through enough one-sided relationships doesn't just become selective about who they trust. They sometimes begin to wonder whether anyone is actually capable of meeting them where they are. Whether depth is something other people genuinely want or simply something they accept from the empath while offering shallowness in return. Whether the kind of mutual, honest, reciprocal connection they are looking for actually exists, or whether it is something they have invented in their need for it to be real. That doubt is one of the loneliest places a person can live, and yet there is something important here, something worth naming clearly. The fact that empaths have been drawn into draining relationships is not evidence that they are weak or naive. It is evidence that they are genuine, that their care is real, that they show up for people in a way that most of the world does not. The problem was never the depth of what they gave. The problem was that it was given to people who were not capable of receiving it with the respect it deserved. That is not a flaw in the empath. It is a tragedy of misplacement. The empath's capacity for deep, selfless, transformative connection is not the thing that needs to change. What needs to change is the belief that everyone who reaches for that capacity is worthy of it. Not every person in pain deserves unlimited access to the person trying to heal them. Not every wounded soul is ready to do the work of becoming someone who can love in return. And learning to tell the difference, learning to protect the gift without extinguishing it, is perhaps the most difficult and necessary lesson an empath will ever face. You cannot keep pouring from a vessel you have never once stopped to refill and call that love. Most people, when they get hurt, feel it and then move through it. The pain is real, but it has edges, a beginning and an end. They feel the sting of a harsh word, the discomfort of a falling out, the disappointment of a friendship that didn't survive. And then gradually life moves forward. The memory softens, the wound closes, they re-enter the world without carrying the full weight of what happened. This is not criticism, it is simply how most nervous systems process emotional pain. They register it, respond to it, and eventually release it. For an empath, this is not how it works. When an empath is hurt, the experience does not stay on the surface. It goes deep, immediately, all the way down. A careless comment lands not just as a sting, but as something that shakes their entire understanding of the relationship it came from. A betrayal doesn't just hurt, it replays, over and over. Not because the empath is weak or dramatic, but because they process at a depth that makes every significant emotional experience feel total. All-consuming, like weather that moves through every room of the house rather than just rattling the windows from outside. This intensity of emotional processing is not a choice. It is simply how the empath is built. Their inner world is extraordinarily detailed. When something painful happens, they don't just feel the surface emotion. They feel the implications, the history behind the moment, the significance of what the hurt reveals about the person who caused it, the way it connects to older wounds they thought were healed. The questions it raises about their own judgment, their own worth, their own capacity to trust their instincts. A single act of betrayal can set off an entire internal investigation that runs for days, weeks, sometimes months. Not because they are dwelling unnecessarily, but because their mind and heart are genuinely trying to make sense of something that cut through every layer of their being. This is important to understand because it changes everything about how empaths approach closeness. When you know from lived experience that getting hurt will not just sting but will unravel you, that the aftermath will cost you sleep, stability, the ability to feel like yourself, you naturally become more careful about who you allow close enough to hurt you. Not consciously at first, but the body learns, the nervous system remembers. And over time, that memory shapes behavior in ways that look like guardedness, like distance, like an unwillingness to fully open up. What it actually is intelligence. Hard-earned, painful intelligence about the true cost of misplaced trust. Conflict is particularly brutal for the empath. Most people dislike conflict. But for the empath, conflict doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels destabilizing in a way that is almost physical. When someone they care about is angry with them, the empath doesn't just feel the discomfort of tension. They feel the full emotional force of the other person's anger, as if it belongs to them. They absorb it, internalize it, turn it over in their hands until they have examined every possible angle. They lie awake, running through the conversation, identifying everything they could have said differently, questioning their own motivations, wondering if the other person's pain is somehow entirely their fault, even when it clearly is not. They cannot simply table a conflict and return to it later. It lives inside them, loudly until it is resolved, and sometimes even after resolution, the echo remains. This makes the empath extraordinarily averse to certain kinds of relationships, the ones with frequent conflict, volatile emotions, unpredictable shifts in dynamic. They are not avoiding conflict because they are conflict avoidant in the shallow sense. They are avoiding it because the price of living inside recurring conflict is one their system simply cannot afford. Each unresolved tension, each harsh exchange, each period of coldness between themselves and someone they care about costs them in ways that are deeply real and deeply taxing. Sleep, appetite, concentration, the ability to feel at peace inside their own mind. These things all go when conflict enters. And knowing this, the empath becomes selective, sometimes extremely selective, about the environments and relationships they allow themselves to inhabit. Criticism carries its own particular weight. For most people, criticism lands as feedback, useful or not, depending on the source, but ultimately just information. For the empath, criticism, especially from someone they respect or love, lands like an event. Not just because they are sensitive, but because they instantly feel the emotional content behind it alongside the words themselves. They feel the disappointment or the frustration or the dismissal carried inside the criticism, and that emotional freight hits them as powerfully as the words. And because their inner world is so detailed, so inclined towards self-examination, criticism has a way of finding every existing doubt they have about themselves and amplifying it. A single poorly delivered piece of feedback from the right person at the wrong moment can send an empath into days of internal questioning that is entirely disproportionate to the original exchange, and yet feels completely warranted from the inside. This is not fragility. It is depth being mistaken for fragility. There is an enormous difference between those two things. Fragility breaks and stays broken. Depth feels everything fully and still finds its way back. But the path back for the empath is longer and more demanding than it is for most. And that longer path, walked enough times, teaches a lesson that becomes embedded in how they move through relationships. The lesson that who they let in matters enormously. That the wrong person's carelessness can cost them weeks of stability. That they cannot afford to spend their emotional reserves on people who treat their sensitivity as a weakness to dismiss or a tool to exploit. Betrayal deserves its own mention because for the empath, betrayal is not just painful, it is shattering in a very specific way. When the empath trusts someone, they do not do it lightly. Trust for them is extended slowly, carefully, after a great deal of quiet observation. It is built piece by piece over time, and it is real, not a formality, not an assumption. but something they have genuinely chosen to extend based on everything they have felt and seen in that person. When someone betrays that trust, the damage is not just emotional, it is something closer to a reorientation of reality. Because the empath trusted not just their feelings, but their perception, their deep, careful, attentive reading of the other person. And betrayal means that reading was wrong, which calls into question not just the friendship, but the empath's own instinct, their own ability to know people, their own sense of what is real. That particular wound, the doubt it plants in the empath's relationship with their own perception, can be one of the most lasting and disorienting consequences of betrayal. Because the empath's sensitivity is also their compass. It is how they navigate people and relationships and the world. When it leads them to someone who ultimately hurts them, the compass itself begins to feel unreliable. And an empath who no longer trusts their own depth is an empath who has lost one of their most essential tools for living. This is why, after enough deep hurt, so many empaths retreat into smaller and smaller social circles. It is not a dramatic decision. It does not happen all at once. It is a gradual narrowing driven by the quiet accumulation of experiences that proved too costly, each significant hurt that cut too deep, each conflict that disrupted their inner world for too long, each criticism that triggered weeks of self-examination, each betrayal that left them questioning their own perception. Slowly, the radius of who they allow close shrinks. Not because they have stopped believing in connection, but because they have become acutely, intimately aware of what the wrong connection costs them. And in the absence of safe people, people who handle them with care, who fight fairly, who keep their word, who understand that an empath's depth is something to be honored rather than tested, solitude begins to feel not just acceptable, but genuinely preferable. Because solitude does not betray them. Solitude does not land careless words at midnight that play on repeat for a week. Solitude does not shake their sense of self or leave them rebuilding something that took years to construct. Solitude simply holds them quietly while the world outside continues to misunderstand what it means to feel everything this deeply. The depth that makes you feel everything is not your wound. It is the standard by which you now wisely measure who deserves to stand close to it. There is something that happens when an empath tries to explain why they have so few close friends. They watch the other person's expression shift, a slight confusion, a subtle pulling back. Because to most people, the idea of choosing depth over company, of turning down connection because it doesn't meet a certain standard, sounds like pride, like elitism. Like someone who has simply decided they are too good for ordinary people. And the empath, who has spent years being misread, recognizes that expression immediately. They have seen it before. And rather than explain themselves again, they go quiet. Because how do you describe a hunger that most people have never felt to someone who has never gone without? The truth is that the empath standard for connection is not about superiority. It has nothing to do with looking down on people who are content with casual friendships, small talks, surface level bonds. The empath does not judge those people. They often genuinely envy them. The ability to move lightly through social life, to enjoy a conversation without needing it to mean something, to have many friends without needing any of them to be everything, that looks to the empath like a kind of freedom they have never been able to access. Not because they refused it, but because their entire inner architecture makes shallow connection feel not just unsatisfying, but actively uncomfortable. Like being handed a glass of water when what the body is dying of thirst for cannot be found in a glass. The empath feels connection differently. When it is real, when it is deep, when it is mutual and honest and free of performance, it is one of the most nourishing experiences available to a human being. It feels something that nothing else reaches. It quiets the internal noise. It makes the empath feel, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that they are not alone inside the particular world they inhabit, that someone else is here, fully here. Not performing presence, but actually offering it. And in those moments, the empath understands completely why they have held out for so long. Because this specific quality of connection is what they have always been looking for. And everything that fell short of it was not a failure to connect. It was simply not this. But those moments are rare, genuinely rare, and the space between them can stretch out for a very long time. And it is in that space, in the waiting, in the long stretches of solitude between real connections, that the empath has to confront something uncomfortable. The question of whether their standard is wisdom or self-protection dressed up as wisdom. Whether they are holding out for depth because depth is what they genuinely need, or whether the standard has quietly become a wall, a way of ensuring that no one gets close enough to hurt them again. A reason that sounds noble but functions as armor. This distinction matters. Because there is a version of high standards that comes from self-knowledge, from genuinely understanding what you need in order to thrive in relationship with another person. And there is a version that comes from fear, from the accumulated damage of too many wrong connections. From a heart that has been given freely and returned carelessly enough times that it has begun to manufacture reasons to stay closed. The empath who is being honest with themselves knows the difference. They know when the standard they are applying is real, and they know when it has become a way of preemptively protecting themselves from a hurt that hasn't happened yet. The difficulty is that both versions feel identical from the inside. The refusal that comes from genuine discernment feels the same as the refusal that comes from fear. They wear the same face. They use the same language, and only the empath, in their most honest moments, can tell which one is operating, which is why self-examination for the empath is not optional. It is essential. Because the goal was never to need no one. The goal was always to find the ones worth needing. What the empath is actually searching for, stripped of all complexity, is safety. Not the safety of predictability or comfort or ease, but the safety of being truly known and not used against themselves. They want to be fully visible to another person, with all their depth, all their sensitivity, all the parts of themselves that the world has repeatedly told them are too much, and have that person stay. Not despite what they see, but because of it. The empath wants someone who does not flinch at depth, who does not get overwhelmed by emotion, who does not mistake sensitivity for weakness or intensity for instability. Someone who meets them where they actually are, not where it would be more convenient for them to be. This is the standard. And stated plainly, it does not sound unreasonable. It sounds like what most people would say they want if they were being honest about it. But most people have not felt the specific loneliness of being in a room full of people and still feeling completely unseen. Most people have not experienced the particular exhaustion of being loved for a version of themselves they had to carefully construct to be acceptable. Most people have not had the experience of letting someone see the real thing, the full, unedited, deeply feeling thing, and watching that person slowly back away because it asked too much of them. The empath has felt all of these things, and those experiences are why the standard exists where it does. There is grief built into this kind of longing, real, quiet, persistent grief. Because the empath who has been waiting a long time for the right connection begins to accumulate something that is hard to name but easy to feel, a weariness, a wandering. A low, continuous ache that sits just beneath the surface of everyday life, not dramatic, not debilitating, but present. The awareness that something essential is missing. That the world is full of people and yet the specific kind of company they need is somehow always just out of reach. That they are surrounded by almost but not quite. And almost, for someone who knows exactly what the real thing feels like, is its own particular form of loneliness. What makes this loneliness unique is that it cannot be solved by simply spending more time with people. That is the solution most people offer, and it misses the point entirely. The empath is not lonely because they are alone. They are lonely because they have not yet found the rare person who can occupy the space their depth has made room for. And filling that space with people who cannot reach it does not relieve the longing. It confirms it. Every shallow conversation, every performance of friendship, every connection that stays permanently surface level is another reminder that what they are looking for is not here, not in this person, not in this room, not yet. And so the empath waits, continues to exist in solitude that is frequently mistaken for contentment, continues to be seen as someone who prefers to be alone when the truth is far more specific and far more tender than that. They do not prefer to be alone. They prefer to be alone over being with the wrong people. They prefer the clean silence of solitude over the particular noise of a connection that costs them their sense of self. They prefer to keep the space inside them clear and available for something real rather than fill it with something that will only need to be emptied out later. This is not arrogance wearing the costume of introspection. This is someone who has felt the difference between being truly met and being merely tolerated and has decided quietly and firmly that they will not spend their life settling for the latter. That decision comes at a cost. The cost is visible, the small circle, the long stretches of solitude, the relationships that never quite deepen the way the empath hoped they would. But the alternative cost is invisible and far higher. The cost of spending years in connections that slowly hollow you out. Of performing a version of yourself that can be accepted by people who would leave if they saw the real one. Of being surrounded and still entirely alone, which is the loneliest way to be alone there is. The empath who holds out for something real is not asking too much of the world. They are simply refusing to ask too little of themselves.